Good morning. Thank you so much for clicking to watch what I have to say. But I want to talk about what's happening in Kenya and, of course, in the developing world regarding the high inflation, IMF loans and World Bank loans that are being sent to Africa. We've just seen what has happened in Kenya in the last 3 to 4 weeks, whereby the young people, the Gen Zs, have taken to the street. Well, the economic hardship experienced by African countries post World Bank and IMF loans is a big poignant reminder of the complexities of development and development financing. While debt forgiveness was a step in the right direction, true economic independence will come from within the countries. They'll come through concerted efforts of the African nations and, of course, on their people. Together, I think we can rewrite the narrative and pave the way for a prosperous and self-reliant Africa. Because Africa is facing a debt crisis. It's all over Africa. It's a problem that has been building for decades, years, ever since the World Bank and IMF came into the picture. And it's been building for decades, and it's getting worse. Nothing seems to be getting better. Countries are borrowing more and more money, but they're struggling to repay these loans. You get a loan, and the IMF and World Bank give you these loans. They know you cannot repay them, and they continue to give you these loans. Then it hits the fan. So this is putting a huge strain in African economies, and it's having a devastating impact on the lives of the ordinary people. I mean, the rich people keep getting richer because they actually steal the money and they're corrupt, while the ordinary people have really nothing. No basic food, education, security, nothing. So we are talking about basic services, healthcare, education. These are the things that people rely on to live on a healthy and productive life. You need education so that you can improve your life. But when countries are drowning in debt, they have to cut back on these essential services. That means that people are getting sicker or they're getting sicker. Kids are missing out on school, and the cycle of poverty continues because you can't go to school, you're sick, you can't go to school, and so you don't get the education or you just can't afford the school altogether. This isn't just an African problem, it's actually a global problem. You go to Southeast Asia, but mostly in Africa, where it is. So the international community needs to step up and do more for the African countries so that they can get out of this debt because it's a vicious circle. They'll never get out of this debt. We need to find sustainable solutions that will allow African countries to grow and then also their economies to grow, and then they can provide the people with just basic services. It's time to stop kicking the can around the road and actually face the problem as it is. We need to act now before it's too late because that is the direction all these developing countries are heading to. So ActionAid, an international development charity, has sounded the alarm about Africa's debt crisis for years. Their persistent efforts aim to bring global attention to the dire financial straits many African nations find themselves in. Their largest, or let me say the latest report, called 50 Years of Failure, the IMF, Debt and Austerity in Africa, paints a bleak picture. This comprehensive document delves into the historic context of the ongoing repercussions of financial policies imposed by the international bodies. The report by ActionAid argues that the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has been pushing measures on African countries for decades. And these measures have actually made the debt crisis even worse. The data presented is compelling, showing a clear correlation between IMF policies and the worsening economic conditions globally. These austerity measures is basically a fancy word for cutting spending. It involves reducing government expenditures in an attempt to balance budgets and reduce this debt. But already, these African countries cannot pay the debt. And when IMF pushed these measures, then the situation in these African countries gets worse. When the IMF tells a country to implement austerity measures, it means cutting back on things like healthcare. It means cutting back things on education. It means cutting back on social safety nets. These are critical services that directly impact the well-being of the population. The idea is that this will free up money to pay back debts. Which money? There's no money to free up. However, the reality is often starkly different. It is just not like cut costs on here and pay us our debt. In reality, it often just makes things worse. The economic downturns that follow these austerity measures can be extremely severe, leading to prolonged periods of hardship on these developing or underdeveloped countries. When you cut spending on essential services, people suffer. The most vulnerable population are hit the hardest. The children, people with disabilities, the older retired people. So people with other exhibiting circumstances, and of course, people who have inequalities that already exist. So they get sicker. They can't afford to send their kids to school, and they're more likely to fall into poverty. The cycle of poverty becomes harder, and it becomes even harder to break, trapping generations in a struggle of survival. All you have to do is walk in the slums of Nairobi, Kenya, slums of Lagos. All you have to go is go to the slums of Accra. All you have to do is walk in Soweto in South Africa. This in turn can lead to social unrest and instability. We have just seen what has been happening in Kenya with the Gen Zs in the street. And then the police, with lack of proper training, open gunfire on these kids who are on the streets because the situation is too hard for them to bear. When people are pushed to the brink, the social fabric begins to fray, leading to protests and sometimes even serious conflicts. So, while these IMF and World Bank austerity measures might seem to be a good idea on paper, it often backfires spectacularly. The intended economic stability is rarely achieved, and the social costs are just worsened, and of course, they're immense. So in the Action Aid report, it is clearly a wake-up call. It urges policymakers and international financial institutions to reconsider this approach, or to reconsider their approach of austerity measures. We need to rethink the way we address debt in Africa. Sustainable and inclusive economic policies are essential for long-term growth, other than just saying cut costs right now or you're finished. Austerity is not the answer. Being strict and mean is not the answer. The evidence is clear that it leads to more pain, it leads to more anger, it leads to more instability, it actually means to more poverty. We need to find a solution that will help countries grow their economies and provide their people without plunging them further into debt and poverty. This means investing in public services, fostering economic diversification, and ensuring that financial aid is used effectively to build resilient economies. Now, let's talk about the real world impact on these austerity measures. When governments are forced to cut spending, one of the first places they look is public services. This means hospitals, schools, social welfare programs are all cut because the ones who get the hit the hardest. Who suffers the most? You guessed it, the most vulnerable members of the society. Imagine you're a parent in a country struggling with this debt. You're already struggling to put food on the table. Now imagine the local clinic has to close because of budget cuts. Now you don't even have the hospital in your surrounding. Your child gets sick and you can't afford private healthcare because it's way too expensive. You know, the looters of the countries can afford the private healthcare, but most people cannot. What do? This is the reality of millions and millions of people across Africa. Austerity measures are literally costing lives, they're killing people, and driving people deeper into poverty. They're denying people access to essential healthcare, education, and other vital services. It's a moral outrage, and it's time for it to end. It's time for it to stop, and then the global or the world organizations that lend this money should look at ways of how to improve the situation. We need to invest in public services, not cut them. How do you cut public services? They need to invest more in that. Strong public services are the foundation of a healthy and prosperous society. If everybody is sick, how do you expect that society to prosper? By investing in healthcare, education, and social services, we can create a more just and equitable world for everybody. Right, the way it is right now, African countries are supposed to be poor, and then the West is supposed to be rich because they're the ones lending this money. And you know, these companies are businesses. IMF is a business. World Bank is a business. They're just looking at how they can make profit. It's not for fun. They're not doing it to support people. But in the meantime, they're creating more poverty and death instead of creating an equitable society where everybody can grow properly. So, voices from the ground, stories of struggle, stories of resilience is everywhere. People are suffering. According to the report, ActionAid does not rely on statistics and economics jargon. They actually go beyond the numbers to paint a vivid picture of this human experience. You know, I know data is very important. We make decisions on data, but in Africa, we still don't have a good mechanism to collect all this data. Building this database with people is still a work in progress. So, going out and actually talking to these people and hearing their stories is actually what makes a big difference. This report features powerful testimonies from people living in the front lines of the debt crisis. These are the real stories of the real people sharing their struggles and how they're suffering. And of course, the struggles and hopes. Everybody's optimistic. So the stories of nurses working tirelessly in an understaffed hospital, teachers struggling to educate children in overcrowded classrooms, and families struggling to make ends meet. All these people have stories, and each story is testament to their resilience and, of course, determination to survive in very, very difficult circumstances. For example, in Ghana, A nurse, who I will not mention her name, gave a description or describes the impossible choice she has to make every day. Her story is one of many that highlights the dire situation faced by healthcare workers. Getting transportation to work, then the pay is little, rent is high, inflation is high. What is she supposed to do? Should she just quit her job? Because everything goes away. At the end of the day, she has no savings. So with limited resources and staff, she's forced to prioritize patients because the hospital is short-staffed, knowing that some will inevitably miss out on life-saving treatment. You're there, you know that you don't have enough staff and you cannot support everybody in the hospital. And this is just not the story of this lady in Ghana. This is a story across Africa. If you go to Kenya, Kenyatta Hospital, Russia Hospital in Kisumu, hospitals in Kiambu, they all face the same thing, short staff. So you're a nurse, there's not enough medication, there's not enough staff to support you, and you know that you have patients who are going to miss out on life-saving treatment just because you don't have enough people. I can tell you that the weight of these choices or the decisions is heavy burden to bear every day. So you're a nurse, every day you have to deal with those choices. What's your quality of life? What do you think when you go home? How do you relax? So it's heartbreaking that the health staff go through, and what can they do? What can they do? The health staff, their words echo the sentiments of many frontline workers who are doing their best in a very impossible situation. You're doomed if you do, you're doomed if you don't. A teacher in Africa that I talked to, or I mean in the report, named Joseph, he talks about the impact of overcrowded classes. His students sit 2 people or 3 people to a desk that is meant for one. So you're a passionate teacher, you love the teaching, education, you want to educate your children or the students, and your passion for teaching is actually there, it's evident. But the challenges are just too much. Overcrowded classes, you cannot attend to the students even if they have questions. You have to be running to the next class because they also need you to impart some knowledge over there. So with more than maybe 100 students crammed into a space designed for 30 students, it's impossible to give each child the individual attention they need. The overcrowded conditions make effective teaching an impossible task. So we are failing these kids. And of course, it's not fair. IMF and World Bank. Frustrations of teachers is just appealing. It's palatable. You can just see, even the dedicated, excited teachers, they wear down and just say this is an impossible task. So these stories that I just mentioned about the nurse and the teacher are a powerful reminder that the debt crisis is not just an abstract economic problem. It's a crisis that affects the way fabric of a society is affected. The very ingenious, very deep fabric. It's a human crisis for real. It's not just economic, it's a human crisis. And the consequences are real. It is just not on paper. The consequences are real. So the impact is felt in every corner of the African continent, from every hospital, every classroom, every library, and beyond. So we need to listen to these voices and take action to address the root cause of this crisis. Only by understanding the human stories behind the statistics, then we can find the real solutions. as opposed to just sitting in a bank in New York and saying austerity measures, cut costs. So there is an unequal burden over here. This austerity disproportionately impacts Africa, Southeast Asia more than anything. And then also it impacts women more than any other gender in the society. Here's the harsh reality. When it comes to austerity measures, women and mothers bear the brunt of the burden. This isn't just a minor inconvenience, it's a significant issue that are meant that are of course that affect millions of lives because you know women work the hardest. They're the ones who have to go to the farm. They're the ones who have to do the digging in those developing countries. It is the women who go fetch for water. They cook and also look for food mostly for the family. Women are disproportionately represented in the low paying jobs. They are more likely to be responsible for the unpaid care work. They often lack the access to the essential services. Think about it. These roles are undervalued and underpaid, yet they're crucial for the functioning of our society. When governments cut back on healthcare, it's women who are mostly likely to miss out on vital maternal and reproductive health services. Of course, this can have long-term consequences on the healthcare and, of course, well-being. When schools close, it's often girls who are forced to drop out to help with household chores or care for the younger siblings. This disrupts their education and, of course, limits their future opportunities. So, when society or social safety nets are slashed, it's women who are most likely to fall into poverty. These cuts mean that the difference between having a safety net and falling through the cracks are just widened, and the cracks are much bigger. So, austerity policies exacerbate existing gender inequalities. So, if you're IMF and World Bank and you're talking, you want to build the girl child, then you know your policies are affecting them even the hardest. You're pushing women further into margins of the society, further out. This marginalization can lead to a cycle of poverty, it can lead to exclusion, and of course, it will lead to heartbreak. So we need to recognize these gender impacts and develop solutions that prioritize the needs of women, children, and girls. This isn't just about fairness, it's about creating a more just and equitable society for all. Again, this just means investing in quality public services, promoting economic empowerment, especially for women, and ensuring that women have an equal voice in decision-making process. Because their perspective is crucial, as women actually constitute more than 50% of the total world population. There's more women in Africa than the men, but they're not part of the decision making because for over time, there's been inequalities against them. They've been limited education. Like I said, if there's a crisis, they're the ones who are going to drop out of school to take care of the family. So we cannot talk about solving debt crisis without addressing the needs of half the population in the world or in Africa. So just like men, women are just victims of IMF and World Bank. and yet they are active agents of change in our society. So with this, I just want to say that a lot has to be done. Debt forgiveness is something that this global organization, multi-billion organizations can do. But also, on the other hand, these African nations must end corruption. I just heard that some ministers, for example, in the Kenyan government, have become billionaires overnight. These people are buying ranches globally using people's or public funds to enrich themselves. They use these monies through corruption to popularize themselves in the society by donating funds in fundraisers so that people like them more. So they use these funds to bribe their way into popularity or being liked. All I can say is Africans should realize that a leader cannot be forced down your throat. Everybody knows what a leader is. When you pay people money so you can be voted in, you know you're probably not the right leader for those people. Why don't you let somebody who really wants that job, somebody who really wants to do service to the people, somebody who's not going to steal money from the society, somebody who's actually going to help uplift these people and get them from poverty to a better place? Why do you want to go there and you know you're only going there to steal? You don't have anything to do with these people. But since you have money, you can bribe your way. As you can see, it's not helping anything. It's just making the situation worse. And the younger people who are suffering